July 98, Fort Knox, Kentucky. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the polished hull of the M60A3 Patton tank. Its olive drab paint had been meticulously restored, every scratch buffed away, every detail returned to its 1983 glory. The tank stood silent in the center of the special exhibit hall at the Patton Museum of Armor and Cavalry, a metal sentinel guarding memories of a war that never happened. Colonel James Iron Jim Wilkins ran a weathered hand along the cold steel of the tank's hull. His fingers, now gnarled with arthritis, traced the faded white lettering on the turret. Thunderbolt. 73 years had etched deep lines into his face, but his eyes remained sharp, alert, seeing beyond the museum walls to another time, another place. "Sir, the cadets are here," said the young museum curator, gesturing toward the entrance where 20 officers in training stood at parade rest. Wilkins nodded, straightening his back with military precision despite the protest of old bones. His civilian clothes, pressed khakis and a blue button-down, were worn with the same dignity as the uniform he'd retired in 15 years earlier. "Send them in." The young officers filed into the room with the cautious reverence of churchgoers, their eyes widening at the sight of the vintage tanks. They gathered around Thunderbolt, maintaining a respectful distance until Wilkins beckoned them closer. "Gentlemen," he began, his voice carrying the gravel of command even after all these years, "this is the tank that made the Russians nervous." He patted the hull affectionately, "And we never had to fire a real shot." A young lieutenant raised his hand. "Sir, is this from Desert Storm?" Wilkins smiled, the kind of smile that suggested the young man had much to learn. "No, son, this was 1983. Reforger exercise. The height of the Cold War." He surveyed their faces, looking for a glimmer of recognition. "Any of you study the Battle of Arras, 1940? Blank stares, just as he expected. "Then gather around, because what happened at Arbor Ridge in '83 changed how we think about asymmetric warfare. And it all started with a history lesson nobody wanted to hear." The museum lights dimmed slightly, as if the building itself was settling in for a story. July 1983, Fort Irwin, California. The heat was oppressive, a physical weight pressing down on everything in the Mojave Desert. The thermometer outside the command tent read 104 degrees, but inside the M60A3 Patton tank, the temperature soared past 120. Sweat ran freely down Captain James Wilkins' face, soaking into the collar of his camouflage uniform. At 58, he was at least 2 decades older than most tank commanders in the U.S. Army, a living relic who had refused promotion time and again to stay where he belonged, inside the commander's hatch of an American tank. The radio crackled to life. "All officers report to command post. Briefing in 30 minutes. Over." Wilkins keyed the mic. "Thunder 6, copy, out." He dropped back into the turret and addressed his crew. "Rodriguez, finish the maintenance. I want this old girl ready to roll by sundown." Master Sergeant Frank Doc Rodriguez nodded, his hands already deep in the tank's engine compartment. At 54, he was nearly as old as Wilkins, another Vietnam veteran who had stayed in service long past when most had moved on. "She'll be ready, Captain, just adjusting the tension on the tracks." Wilkins climbed out of the tank, his joints protesting after hours in the confined space. The sun hit him like a physical blow as he surveyed the terrain around him. Fort Irwin's National Training Center had been transformed into a simulation of the Fulda Gap, the expected invasion route if the Soviets ever decided to pour through East Germany into the West. Hills and valleys stretched out, dotted with the shapes of other M60 tanks from his company. In the distance, the snow-capped Sierra Nevada mountains seemed to mock the desert heat with their cool indifference. The world of 1983 was balanced on a knife edge. President Reagan had recently announced the Strategic Defense Initiative, Star Wars, to the press. The Soviets had shot down Korean Airlines Flight 007 just months earlier. NATO and Warsaw Pact forces were playing an elaborate game of chess across Europe, with nuclear annihilation as the potential forfeit. And here in the California desert, the U.S. Army was preparing for what many believed was inevitable: a massive Soviet tank assault through the Fulda Gap. The Reforger exercise, return of forces to Germany, was designed to test America's ability to defend against such an attack. For 2 weeks, American forces would engage in simulated combat against an opposing force that used Soviet tactics and equipment. The command post was a cluster of olive-drab tents surrounded by communications vehicles. Inside the main tent, officers from across the 5th Armored Brigade sat on folding chairs or stood along the canvas walls. The air conditioning unit struggled valiantly against the combined heat of the desert sun and dozens of bodies. Colonel Richard Stanford stood at the front, a map of the exercise area pinned to a board behind him. At 42, Stanford represented the new breed of Army officer. Awesome. West Point educated, politically astute, and technologically savvy. He viewed Wilkins as an anachronism, a stubborn holdover who refused to accept that warfare had changed. Gentlemen, Stanford began as the last officers filtered in. We begin the tactical phase of Reforger 83 at 100 tomorrow. Our mission is to defend the Fulda Gap, or in this case, its simulation here at Fort Irwin, against a simulated Soviet advance. He gestured to the map. OP-4 will be commanded by Major General William Maxwell. They'll be using M1 Abrams tanks painted to resemble Soviet T-80s, with modified turrets to approximate Soviet silhouettes. Wilkins leaned forward, studying the map. The terrain was familiar. He'd trained here many times before, but something about Stanford's deployment plan troubled him. The colonel was spreading forces too thin, creating a classic defense in depth that might work against a conventional attack but would crumble against Soviet deep battle doctrine. Stanford continued, pointing out various defensive positions across the map. We'll establish 3 defensive lines. Alpha Company will take the forward positions along this ridgeline. Bravo will establish at these choke points. Charlie Company will form our mobile reserve, ready to reinforce any section under heavy attack. Wilkins raised his hand. Stanford's jaw tightened slightly, but he nodded. Captain Wilkins? Sir, with respect, this deployment mirrors the French defensive strategy of 1940. The Germans broke through at Sedan because the French spread their forces too thin, especially their armored units. A murmur ran through the assembled officers. Stanford's expression hardened. Captain, we're not fighting World War II Germans. We're simulating a Soviet advance. This deployment follows NATO doctrine. Wilkins stood, moving to the map. Stanford reluctantly stepped aside. The Soviets studied the German breakthrough extensively. Their deep battle doctrine improves on it. Wilkins pointed to the map. If we disperse our armor like this, OP-4 will punch through here, where the terrain allows maximum speed, then encircle our forward elements before we can reposition. Lieutenant Thomas Reed, a fresh-faced West Point graduate who served as Wilkins' executive officer, shifted uncomfortably. He respected Wilkins' experience but found his fixation on historical battles embarrassing. Stanford crossed his arms. Captain, I appreciate your historical perspective, but our deployment follows established doctrine and utilizes modern combat systems the French didn't have. Unless you have an actual alternative to propose? Wilkins met Stanford's gaze steadily. Concentrate our armor, create a mobile striking force that can hit their flanks when they commit to the breakthrough. Make them fight on our terms, not theirs, and leave our forward positions unsupported. That's not how we fight modern battles. Stanford's voice carried the finality of command. Captain, perhaps it's time you left the battlefield to those who understand modern warfare. The tent fell silent. Every officer present recognized the insult for what it was. Wilkins' face remained impassive, but his eyes hardened. Yes, sir, he said finally, his voice even. Will that be all, Colonel? Stanford nodded curtly. Dismissed. The officers filed out, carefully avoiding Wilkins' gaze. Only Reed stayed behind, awkwardly gathering his notes as Wilkins stood staring at the map. Sir, are you... I'm fine, Lieutenant. Wilkins finally turned away from the map. We have work to do. The walk back to his tank was long and quiet. The insult still burned, not because Stanford had questioned his relevance, he was used to that, but because Stanford was making the same mistakes that had led to catastrophic defeats throughout history, and no one seemed willing to listen. Back at his quarters, a Spartan tent with a cot, footlocker, and small field desk, Wilkins opened his footlocker and removed an old leather-bound book. The cover was worn, the pages yellowed with age. The title, embossed in fading gold, read, Armored Warfare, Lessons from the European Theater, 1939 to 1945. He opened the front cover, where a handwritten inscription read, To Sergeant James Wilkins, Sr., whose courage at Bastogne saved many of His Majesty's soldiers. With gratitude, Captain Edward Morris, Royal Tank Regiment, 1945. The book had been his father's prized possession, a gift from a British officer whose unit had been saved when Sergeant Wilkins' Sherman tank had held a crossroads during the Battle of the Bulge. Wilkins Sr. had passed it to his son when young James enlisted for Vietnam, along with a piece of advice. Tanks win battles when you use them right. Use them wrong and they're just expensive coffins. Wilkins flipped to the chapter on the Battle of Arras. He'd read it countless times, but now he studied it with renewed intensity. In May 1940, as German forces swept through France, a small British counterattack near Arras had temporarily halted the German advance. Just 74 British tanks, outgunned and outclassed by German panzers, had caused enough confusion to make the German high command pause their entire offensive for 24 critical hours. The key wasn't the number of tanks or even their quality. It was how they were used, concentrated for maximum psychological impact, striking where least expected, creating an illusion of greater strength. As Wilkins read, his father's voice seemed to echo across the decades. The British at Arras made Rommel think he was facing hundreds of tanks when he only saw a few dozen. That's how you fight when you're outnumbered. Make them see ghosts. A knock on the tent pole interrupted his thoughts. Enter. Rodriguez ducked through the tent flap, removing his sweat-soaked cap. Thunderbolts ready, Captain. New tension on the tracks, fresh filters on the air system, gun stabilization checked and double-checked. Wilkins nodded, closing the book carefully. Thank you, Doc. Sit down. Rodriguez eased himself onto the only other chair in the tent. What's got you looking like you've seen a ghost, Jim? They'd served together in Vietnam, saved each other's lives more than once. Off-duty, first names were permitted. Not seeing ghosts, thinking about making some. Wilkins tapped the book cover. Remember what my old man used to say about Arras? Rodriguez grinned. Make them see what ain't there. Your daddy was a smart tanker. Stanford's making the same mistakes the French made in 1940, spreading us too thin, rigid defensive lines, no concentration of armor. And you told him? Tried to. Got told I was obsolete. Rodriguez snorted. Hell, we're both obsolete. Don't mean we're wrong. He leaned forward. What are you thinking, Jim? Before Wilkins could answer, Lieutenant Reed appeared at the tent entrance, his young face flushed with either heat or embarrassment. Captain Wilkins, sir, intelligence update from brigade. Colonel Stanford requests all company commanders for an immediate briefing. Wilkins exchanged a glance with Rodriguez. That was fast. Briefing's not scheduled for another 3 hours. Something's changed, sir. They're saying OPFOR has repositioned overnight. The command tent was even more crowded than before. Stanford stood at the map board, his face grim. Intelligence officers bustled around him, pinning new markers to the map. New intelligence, Stanford began without preamble. OPFOR has doubled their armored strength. They now field 7 tank battalions instead of the expected 3. Murmurs spread through the tent. 7 battalions meant over 200 tanks, nearly a 3-to-1 advantage against the 5th Brigade's armor. Stanford continued, his voice tight. They've also modified their approach. Instead of the expected 3-pronged advance, they appear to be massing for a single breakthrough here. He pointed to the eastern sector of the map. The Arbor Ridge approach. Wilkins studied the map. Arbor Ridge was a long, rugged elevation that controlled access to a valley ideal for an armored thrust. If OPFOR secured it, they could pour through the valley and outflank the entire American defensive position. Stanford turned to his operations officer. Revised deployment plan, Alpha and Bravo will maintain their positions. Charlie Company will redeploy to reinforce the eastern approach. Wilkins felt a chill despite the tense heat. Sir, if we commit Charlie to a fixed defensive position, we lose our mobile reserve. I'm aware, Captain. Stanford's tone was clipped. But we have no choice. We need armor on that eastern flank. With respect, sir, splitting our armor across the front guarantees we'll be defeated in detail. The Soviets, OPFOR, will concentrate their force, punch through, then roll up our line from the east. Stanford's patience visibly frayed. Do you have a better suggestion, Captain? One that doesn't involve refighting World War II? Wilkins approached the map. Give me a free hand with Charlie Company. Let me operate independently, strike at their flanks and rear. If we can't stop their breakthrough, we can at least disrupt it, buy time for the rest of the brigade to reposition. The tent fell silent. Stanford stared at Wilkins for a long moment. You want me to let you take 16 tanks against 200? Stanford's voice dripped with skepticism. Not head on, sir. Hit and run. Make them think we're stronger than we are. Force them to slow down. Look over their shoulders. Stanford shook his head. It's suicide. It's our best chance, sir. Reed stepped forward. Colonel, I've reviewed the historical precedents for this approach. There is some validity to... Lieutenant, Stanford cut him off. I don't need a history lesson. He turned back to Wilkins. You really believe this will work? I believe it's better than waiting to be overrun, sir. Stanford studied the map again. weighing options that grew more limited by the minute. Finally, he nodded. Very well, Captain. Charlie Company will deploy to Arbor Ridge with orders to delay the OPFOR advance by any means necessary. His eyes locked with Wilkins. But understand this. If you fail, the entire brigade could be outflanked. The exercise will be over before it begins. Wilkins nodded. Understood, sir. As the briefing concluded and officers dispersed to their units, Reed caught up with Wilkins outside the command tent. Sir, what historical precedence was I about to cite in there? I was bluffing. Wilkins smiled slightly. Good bluff, Lieutenant. When we get back to the company, I'll show you. Time for you to learn about Arras. Charlie Company assembled in the fading desert light. 16 M60A3 Patton tanks and their crews, along with supporting infantry and M113 armored personnel carriers. The men, already tired from weeks of preparation, looked warily at the darkening eastern horizon where OPFOR waited. Wilkins gathered his tank commanders around a sand table model of Arbor Ridge that Rodriguez had constructed. The men knelt or crouched around it, their faces ghostly in the light of electric lanterns. Gentlemen, at Bo 500 tomorrow, OPFOR begins their advance with approximately 200 tanks. They expect to find a thin defensive screen they can punch through quickly. Instead, they're going to find Charlie Company. One of the younger tank commanders, Sergeant Willis, spoke up. All due respect, sir, 16 tanks isn't going to stop 200. We're not going to stop them, Sergeant. We're going to haunt them. Wilkins pointed to the sand table. Arbor Ridge isn't just one elevation. It's a series of interconnected hills and ravines. Perfect terrain for ambush and evasion. He began placing small tank models across the terrain. We'll divide into 3 groups. Lieutenant Reed will command 4 tanks on the southern approach. Sergeant Willis, you'll take 4 on the northern side. I'll take the remaining 8 in the center to serve as our primary strike force. Reed studied the deployment. Sir, doctrine calls for concentration of force. We're splitting up. Only initially, Lieutenant. We'll conduct choreographed strikes, hit their column, then withdraw and reposition. Different units will engage from different directions, creating the impression of a much larger force. Rodriguez added, and we've modified the tank's exhaust systems to produce more smoke than normal. Between that and the dust we'll kick up, OPFOR will see ghosts everywhere they look. Wilkins continued, we'll focus on their flanks and rear elements. Supply vehicles, command posts, artillery positions. Make them paranoid, force them to divert forces to protect their logistics. Reed shook his head. Captain, this goes against everything they taught us at West Point. It's not standard doctrine. No, Lieutenant, it's not. Wilkins fixed Reed with a steady gaze. It's the doctrine of necessity. When you're outnumbered and outgunned, you don't fight by the book. The book was written for the side with the advantage. He straightened up, looking each man in the eye. We all know the stakes. This is just an exercise, but what we learn here could save lives if the real thing ever happens. If the Soviets come through the Fulda Gap, they'll have 3 times our tanks, just like OPFOR does now. So what's the objective, sir? Asked Willis. How do we win this thing? We're not here to win, Sergeant. We're here to buy time. Every hour we delay OPFOR is another hour for the rest of the brigade to prepare. If we can force them to halt their advance for even half a day, we've succeeded. Rodriguez spoke up. Captain, what about night operations? Wilkins smiled. I'm glad you asked, Doc. He reached into a crate and pulled out several unusual-looking devices. These are prototype thermal imagers, not officially in service yet, but I called in some favors. We'll mount them on 2 tanks per group. That gives us an advantage after dark. The men murmured, examining the equipment with interest. Night fighting capability would be a significant edge, even if limited to a few tanks. One more thing, Wilkins added. OPFOR thinks we're just a speed bump. They expect us to behave like a normal delaying force, fall back steadily, maybe set up a few ambushes. They don't expect us to attack. That surprise is our greatest weapon. Reed still looked unconvinced. Sir, with all due respect, this plan seems unorthodox. It is, Lieutenant, but unorthodox is exactly what we need right now. Wilkins gestured to the vast desert beyond their position. Out there, we're facing an enemy that expects us to play by the rules. Our job is to rewrite those rules. As the briefing concluded, the men dispersed to their tanks, preparing for the pre-dawn deployment. Reed lingered behind, still studying the sand table. Something on your mind, Lieutenant? Wilkins asked. Sir, I understand the theory, but in practice, we're still 16 tanks against 200. Wilkins knelt beside the sand table again. Let me tell you about Arras. May 1940, the Germans had broken through at Sedan, their panzers racing for the Channel coast. The British launched a counterattack near Arras with about 70 tanks, many of them outclassed by German armor. They hit the Germans where they didn't expect, created confusion, forced the entire German advance to halt for 24 critical hours. And what happened to those British tanks, sir? Wilkins met his gaze. Most were destroyed or disabled, but that 24-hour delay allowed hundreds of thousands of Allied troops to reach Dunkirk and evacuate. Those tankers knew they were sacrificing themselves for a larger objective. Reed was silent for a moment. Is that what we're doing, sir? Sacrificing ourselves? This is just an exercise, Lieutenant. The worst we'll face is embarrassment and some criticism in the after-action review. But the principle is the same. Sometimes a small force making a big noise can change the course of a battle. As Reed departed, Rodriguez approached. He's a good kid, just needs to loosen up a bit. Wilkins nodded. He will. Either that or tomorrow's going to be very educational for him. Speaking of education, Rodriguez said, Stanford's setting us up to fail, you know. If this works, it makes him look bad for not thinking of it. If it fails, he can blame the crazy old Vietnam vet who wouldn't follow doctrine. Probably, Wilkins shrugged. Doesn't matter. We do what's right, not what's politically smart. Just like Nam. Rodriguez grinned. Remember that time outside Pleiku? 9 tanks against a whole NVA regiment? I remember you telling me it was suicide. It was, but it worked. Rodriguez clapped a hand on Wilkins' shoulder. Get some rest, Jim. Tomorrow's going to be a long day. But sleep eluded Wilkins. He lay on his cot, staring at the canvas ceiling, running through every detail of the plan, every contingency, every way it could go wrong. His father's book lay open on his chest, the page showing a diagram of the Arras battlefield. In the quiet pre-dawn darkness, Wilkins thought about what he hadn't told the men. The British attack at Arras had succeeded because of an error in intelligence. The German commander, Erwin Rommel, had reported being attacked by hundreds of tanks when only a few dozen were actually present. That misconception had rippled up the chain of command, causing the German high command to halt the advance for a full day. Could they recreate that effect here? Could 16 M60 tanks convince AFOR they were facing a much larger force? Wilkins closed his eyes, his father's voice once again echoing in his memory. In war, what they think they see is often more important than what's actually there. At 0400, Wilkins was already at his tank, checking final preparations as his crew prepared for deployment. The desert air was cold, the stars brilliant overhead, but the eastern sky already hinted at the coming dawn. Around him, Charlie Company was quietly coming to life, engines starting with low rumbles, hatches clanging, radio checks crackling through headsets. The M60A3 Patton was an aging warrior. First deployed in the 1960s, it had been continuously upgraded, but was still being phased out in favor of the newer M1 Abrams. The M60A3 featured a 105mm main gun, a diesel engine that produced a distinctive smoke trail, and armor that, while substantial, was increasingly vulnerable to modern anti-tank weapons. But what the M60 lacked in cutting-edge technology, it made up for in reliability and familiarity. Wilkins knew every sound this tank made, every quirk of its handling, every capability and limitation. In his hands, it was not an obsolete machine, but a finely tuned instrument of war. His gunner, Specialist Cooper, climbed into the turret. Gun systems checked and operational, sir. Laser rangefinder calibrated. The loader, Private First Class Martinez, followed. Ammunition loaded and secured. 21 rounds APFSDS, 15 heat, 6 smoke. Rodriguez, who served as Wilkins' driver, started the massive Continental AVDS 1790 diesel engine. The tank shuddered as 750 horsepower came to life. How are the modifications holding up, Doc? Wilkins asked through the intercom. Exhaust restrictor plates are in place. We'll be making enough smoke to hide a division when we need to. Rodriguez's voice carried the quiet confidence of a man who had spent decades keeping machinery functioning under impossible conditions. Wilkins did a final check of his map and the communication plan, then secured them in the waterproof case mounted beside his commander's position. As he prepared to give the order to move out, Reed's tank pulled alongside. Captain, Reed called over the engine noise. Scouts report OPFOR is already moving. They're jumping off early. Wilkins checked his watch. OPFOR was starting 45 minutes ahead of schedule. They're trying to catch us still deploying, Wilkins shouted back. Pass the word. Immediate execution of Plan Arras. Move to phase line Alpha now. Reed nodded and dropped back into his turret. Within moments, the 16 tanks of Charlie Company were moving out, divided into their 3 battle groups, each taking a different route toward Arbor Ridge. As Thunderbolt crested the first rise, Wilkins stood in the commander's hatch, scanning the horizon with his binoculars. In the growing light, he could make out dust clouds to the east, the first signs of Opfer's approach. They were coming fast, confident in their overwhelming numbers. The radio crackled with Reed's voice. "Thunder 6, this is Thunder 2. We're in position at Point Bravo. No contact yet, but dust clouds visible approximately 5 kilometers east. Roger, Thunder 2, hold position and observe. Report any changes in their direction or speed." Wilkins directed his own group to their designated positions along the central ridge. From here, they had excellent visibility and fields of fire across the valley below, while the broken terrain offered multiple routes for rapid repositioning. As the sun breached the horizon, Wilkins got his first clear view of the advancing OPFOR column. The sight was sobering. Dozens of tanks, M1 Abrams painted in Soviet-style camouflage to mimic T-80s, advanced in textbook Soviet formation. Behind them came armored personnel carriers, mobile artillery, and supply vehicles. It was a massive force, moving with confidence and purpose. Rodriguez whistled softly over the intercom. "Just like the NVA at Pleiku, they don't think anyone's home." "Let's disabuse them of that notion," Wilkins replied. "All units, maintain radio silence until my command. Remember, we hit hard, we hit fast, then we disappear. Make them see ghosts." The OPFOR column approached the valley below Arbor Ridge. Their lead elements were now less than 2 kilometers away, well within range of the M60's main gun. Still, Wilkins waited. Timing was everything. "Cooper, target the lead command vehicle," Wilkins instructed his gunner. "Martinez, load APF-SDS." "APF-SDS up," Martinez confirmed as he slammed the armor-piercing round into the breech. "Range 1,900 meters, Cooper reported, his eye pressed to the sight. "Target acquired." Wilkins watched the column advance, counting the seconds. The first OPFOR vehicles were entering the kill zone, the area where all 3 Charlie Company groups could bring maximum fire to bear. "All Thunder units," Wilkins spoke into the radio, breaking the long silence. "Execute fire mission Alpha. Fire." 16 105mm guns roared simultaneously from 3 different positions around the valley. The effect was devastating. OPFOR's lead vehicles erupted in simulated destruction, laser sensors registering direct hits, forcing tanks to halt and display the red flags that indicated they were killed in the exercise. More importantly, the fire came from multiple directions, creating the impression of a much larger force. As planned, Charlie Company immediately repositioned after the first volley, moving to secondary firing positions before OPFOR could effectively return fire. "All units, execute smoke plan Charlie," Wilkins ordered. The M60s activated their modified exhaust systems, billowing thick diesel smoke as they maneuvered. Simultaneously, they fired smoke rounds from their main guns and deployed smoke grenades. The combined effect created a massive, obscuring cloud across multiple positions. Through his binoculars, Wilkins watched OPFOR's reaction. As expected, their advance had halted. Command vehicles were regrouping, and units were deploying into defensive positions, trying to assess the threat. "They've stopped," Rodriguez observed. "They're trying to figure out what hit them." "Good. Let's keep them guessing." Wilkins switched to the company frequency. "Execute Phase 2. Thunder 2 group, hit their eastern flank. Thunder 3, strike from the north. My group will reposition to Point Delta." As Charlie Company executed this carefully choreographed dance, OPFOR began to respond. Artillery rounds, simulated by pyrotechnics, began impacting across Arbor Ridge. Return fire from OPFOR tanks kicked up dust and dirt around Charlie Company's positions. Reed's voice came over the radio, tension evident. "Thunder 6, we're taking heavy fire on the eastern flank. Request permission to withdraw to secondary positions." "Negative, Thunder 2, hold position for 30 more seconds, then execute your withdrawal. We need to maintain the illusion of strength." "Roger, Thunder 6, holding for 30. Wilkins knew he was asking a lot of the young lieutenant. In a real battle, those 30 seconds could mean the difference between survival and destruction. But in this exercise, it was crucial to maintain the psychological pressure on OPFOR. From his vantage point, Wilkins could see OPFOR commanders struggling to assess the situation. Their advance, so confident minutes ago, had fragmented into a series of defensive positions. Tanks were rotating turrets in different directions, unsure where the next attack would come from. "It's working," he murmured. "They think they're surrounded." Rodriguez guided Thunderbolt skillfully through a narrow ravine, emerging onto a plateau that offered a perfect firing position against OPFOR's supply vehicles. Cooper, target the fuel trucks in the rear echelon, Wilkins ordered. Target acquired. Range 2,600 meters. Fire. The 105-millimeter gun roared, sending its simulated projectile downrange. Through his binoculars, Wilkins saw the hit register on an OPFOR fuel tanker. Reload and fire at will. Target their logistics vehicles. For the next 10 minutes, Thunderbolt's gun fired steadily, each shot finding its mark. Around them, the other tanks of Charlie Company were executing similar strikes, appearing briefly to fire, then disappearing into the smoke and dust. Reed's voice came over the radio again. Thunder 6, OPFOR is deploying reconnaissance units to our southern flank. They're trying to pinpoint our positions. Roger, Thunder 2, all units execute maneuver plan Delta. Pull back to the secondary ridgeline. Charlie Company began a fighting withdrawal, continuing to fire as they moved to their next positions. The maneuver was perfectly executed, tanks disappearing into ravines only to reappear on different parts of the ridge, maintaining constant pressure while giving the impression of a much larger force repositioning. Inside OPFOR's command post, Major General William Maxwell studied the tactical display with growing concern. Reports were flooding in from his unit commanders, enemy tanks appearing in multiple locations, striking with precision, then vanishing. "How many tanks are we facing?" he demanded of his intelligence officer. "Sir, initial reports suggested a company-sized element, but we're receiving fire from at least 3 different battalion-sized positions." "That's impossible. 5th Brigade doesn't have that many tanks in this sector." Maxwell studied the map. "Unless," the intelligence officer waited expectantly, "unless they've reinforced overnight, pull back the advance until we can get a better assessment of enemy strength and disposition." "Sir, with respect, we outnumber them significantly, even if they've reinforced." "I know what happened at Arras in 1940, Major." Maxwell's voice was firm. "I'm not Rommel, but I'm not a fool either. We advance when I know what we're facing, not before." The order went out. OPFOR would halt its advance for 24 hours, while reconnaissance elements determined the exact nature of the force opposing them at Arbor Ridge. Back at Arbor Ridge, Wilkins received the news via a scout observation post. "Thunder 6, this is Eagle Eye. OPFOR main elements are withdrawing to defensive positions. Repeat, they are halting their advance." A cheer went up over the company frequency. Wilkins allowed himself a small smile but knew the battle was far from over. "All Thunder units, maintain vigilance. This may be a feint. Continue rotating between positions Alpha through Echo. Keep them guessing." As the sun climbed higher, baking the desert landscape, Charlie Company continued its deception. Tanks appeared briefly on ridgelines, fired, then disappeared. Smoke and dust obscured their movements. Radio transmissions were kept deliberately misleading, suggesting coordination with non-existent units. By noon, it was clear that OPFOR had indeed halted its main advance. Reconnaissance units probed Charlie Company's positions, but made no serious attempt to breach their defenses. Stanford's voice came over the command frequency, surprising Wilkins. "Thunder 6, this is Brigade 6. Report status." "Brigade 6, Thunder 6. We have successfully delayed OPFOR's advance. They appear to be holding position approximately 3 kilometers east of Arbor Ridge." There was a long pause. "Understood, Thunder 6. Maintain your position. The rest of the brigade is repositioning to the Eagle Canyon defense line. Over." "Roger, Brigade 6. We'll hold them as long as possible. Thunder 6 out." Wilkins switched to the company frequency. "You hear that, gentlemen? The rest of the brigade is falling back to Eagle Canyon. That gives them high ground and much better defensive positions." Reed's voice came through, sounding tired but satisfied. "So it worked? We actually delayed 200 tanks with 16? "For now, Lieutenant. But this is just the beginning. OPFOR isn't going to stay confused forever. Sooner or later, they'll figure out our real strength, and then the real test begins." Rodriguez chuckled over the intercom. "Just like your daddy always said, Jim, make 'em see ghosts." Wilkins gazed out across the valley where OPFOR tanks had withdrawn to defensive positions. For the moment, Charlie Company had succeeded beyond all expectations. They had created the illusion of a much larger force and caused OPFOR to halt its entire advance. But the hardest part was yet to come. Once OPFOR realized they had been deceived, their response would be furious. Charlie Company would face the full might of a force that now had something to prove. As the scorching afternoon sun beat down on Thunderbolt's turret, Wilkins thought again about those British tankers at Arras in 1940. They had bought precious time at a terrible cost. History was repeating itself in this California desert, but with one crucial difference. This was an exercise. When it ended, everyone would go home alive. Yet the lessons were deadly serious. If the Cold War ever turned hot, American tankers would face the same desperate odds against Soviet armor. What happened here at Arbor Ridge could save countless lives if it led to better tactics, better training, better preparation for that nightmare scenario. Wilkins checked his watch, 1,300 hours. OPFOR's 24-hour halt meant the rest of the brigade had until tomorrow morning to prepare their new defensive positions at Eagle Canyon. A day that could make all the difference. All Thunder units, Wilkins radioed, rotate to rest positions by section. Maintenance checks on all vehicles. We've won the first round, but tomorrow will be harder. They'll come with everything they have, and they won't be fooled again. As Thunderbolt withdrew to a sheltered position for maintenance and crew rest, Wilkins remained standing in the commander's hatch, scanning the horizon. The ghosts of Eros had bought them valuable time. Now they had to use it wisely. Behind him, the rest of the brigade was executing a controlled withdrawal to Eagle Canyon, their movements covered by Charlie Company's deception. Supply vehicles, artillery units, and infantry that would have been caught in OPFOR's initial breakthrough were now moving to safer ground, preparing a defense in depth that would have been impossible without the delay. Stanford had been wrong about many things, but he'd been right about one. What happened here would determine the outcome of the entire exercise. Charlie Company had changed the equation, giving the brigade a fighting chance against overwhelming odds. Tomorrow would bring a new phase of the battle. OPFOR would come again, angry and determined. Charlie Company would be revealed for what it was, a small force that had bluffed its way to a temporary advantage. The real test was still to come. But for now, as the desert sun began its slow descent toward the western mountains, Wilkins allowed himself a moment of quiet satisfaction. They had done what no one thought possible. They had made 200 tanks stop in their tracks, made their commanders see phantom battalions where only a company stood. They had created ghosts on Arbor Ridge, and for this day at least, those ghosts had won. The desert night fell quickly, transforming the scorching terrain into a land of deep shadows and surprising cold. Stars appeared by the thousands in the clear sky above Arbor Ridge, their light casting a pale glow over the silent tanks of Charlie Company. The temperature had plummeted 30 degrees since sunset, a stark reminder of the Mojave's extremes. Inside Thunderbolt, Captain James Wilkins studied the tactical map under the dim red glow of the turret light. His fingers traced the contours of Arbor Ridge and the surrounding terrain, mind calculating distances, angles, and firing positions. Outside, a cold wind whispered through the ravines and gullies, carrying the distant sounds of OPFOR's vehicles repositioning in the darkness. "Coffee, Captain?" Master Sergeant Rodriguez extended a steaming metal cup through the turret hatch. Wilkins took it gratefully. "Thanks, Doc. Thought you might need it. Been up here plotting for 3 hours straight." The hot liquid was bitter and strong, just as Army coffees should be. Wilkins took a long sip, letting the warmth and caffeine push back the fatigue that threatened to cloud his thinking. "They're moving again," Wilkins said, nodding toward the eastern horizon, setting up for tomorrow. Rodriguez climbed up to stand beside the turret, his experienced eyes scanning the darkness. "Reconnaissance elements, mostly, probing our perimeter, trying to get a fix on our actual strength. Any breakthroughs?" "Not yet. Willis has been playing hide-and-seek with them all evening. Shows a tank here, withdraws, shows up somewhere else. Got them chasing shadows." Wilkins nodded approvingly. Sergeant Willis had taken naturally to the deception tactics, displaying an instinctive understanding of psychological warfare that surprised everyone, especially Lieutenant Reed. "And our young lieutenant?" Rodriguez chuckled softly. "Starting to come around. After that first engagement, he's beginning to think maybe the old man knows something after all." A comfortable silence fell between the two veterans as they watched the desert night. They had been in this position too many times to count, waiting through the dark hours before battle, that liminal space where men confronted their doubts and fears. "They'll figure it out by morning," Wilkins said finally. "Maxwell's no fool. He's got recon drones, infrared, signals intelligence. Sooner or later, he'll realize he's facing 16 tanks, not 60. And then we face the full weight of OPFOR's advance. No more hesitation, no more caution. They'll come with everything they have." Rodriguez took a sip from his own coffee cup. Just like Pleiku. Worse than Pleiku. We had artillery support there. Here, we're on our own. The radio crackled to life, interrupting their conversation. Thunder 6, this is Thunder 2. Perimeter check complete. All units report ready status. Request permission to initiate night rotation schedule. Wilkins reached for the handset. Thunder 2, this is 6. Permission granted. Maintain 50% alert status throughout the night. Roger, Thunder 6. Will comply. Thunder 2 out. Wilkins replaced the handset and returned to his map. Reed was proving more adaptable than expected, embracing the unorthodox tactics once he'd seen their effectiveness. The young lieutenant had even started suggesting modifications to improve their deception operations. "You should get some rest, Jim," Rodriguez said. "Tomorrow's going to be a long day." Wilkins nodded but made no move to leave his position. "I'll turn in soon, just want to finalize the morning deployment plan." Rodriguez knew better than to argue. In Vietnam, Wilkins had earned the nickname Iron Jim, not just for his toughness in combat, but for his relentless preparation. He would squeeze every advantage from the terrain, exploit every opportunity, anticipate every contingency. It was why his crews had the highest survival rate in the battalion, despite often being assigned the most dangerous missions. "Wake me at 0300, Rodriguez said finally. "I'll take the pre-dawn watch." As Rodriguez climbed down from the tank, Wilkins turned his attention back to the map. The 24-hour reprieve they'd gained was almost half over. By dawn, Opfer would be ready to resume their advance, this time with a better understanding of what they faced. But that didn't mean Charlie Company was out of tricks. The night deepened. Across Arbor Ridge, Charlie Company's tanks maintained their vigilance, rotating positions, keeping watch over Opfer's distant perimeter. The modified thermal imagers gave them a crucial advantage after dark, allowing them to track enemy movements while remaining hidden themselves. Inside his tank, Lieutenant Thomas Reed couldn't sleep. His mind kept replaying the day's events, analyzing what he'd seen, comparing it to the tactical doctrine he'd studied at West Point. None of it matched. Wilkins' approach violated practically every principle of modern armored warfare, yet it had worked brilliantly. Reed climbed out of his tank and walked the short distance to where Wilkins was still working by red light in Thunderbolt's turret. "Sir?" he called softly. Wilkins looked up from his maps. "Lieutenant, thought you'd be getting some rest." "Can't sleep, sir." Reed climbed up to stand beside the turret. "Keep thinking about today." "Having second thoughts about our approach?" Reed shook his head. "The opposite, actually. I'm trying to reconcile what I saw today with everything they taught us at the point." He paused, choosing his words carefully. "They never covered anything like this." Wilkins set down his pencil. "They teach you about force multipliers at West Point?" "Of course, sir. Terrain, weather, technology, intelligence advantage. They ever teach you that perception itself can be a force multiplier? That what the enemy thinks he sees can be more important than what's actually there?" Reed considered this. Not explicitly, no. "That's the oldest trick in warfare, Lieutenant. Sun Tzu wrote about it 2,000 years ago. All warfare is based on deception, yet somehow we keep forgetting." "But modern warfare is different," Reed argued. "We have satellites, thermal imaging, signals intelligence. You can't hide a major force anymore." Wilkins smiled slightly. "Maybe not, but you can make a minor force look major if you understand how your enemy processes information." He gestured to the map. "Opfer has all that technology, yet we convinced them they were facing a battalion when they were only facing a company. But they'll figure it out eventually." "Of course they will. The trick isn't to fool them forever. It's to fool them long enough to achieve your objective." Wilkins took a sip of his now cold coffee. "Our objective was to buy time for the brigade to establish a new defensive line. We've done that." Reed was silent for a moment, processing this perspective. "So what's our objective now, sir?" Wilkins tapped the map. "Survival. When Opfer resumes their advance tomorrow, they'll come with everything they have. Our job is to make them pay for every meter, slow them down as much as possible, then extract our forces before we're overrun. A fighting withdrawal?" "Exactly, but with a twist." Wilkins turned to a new page in his notebook, sketching rapidly. "They'll be expecting us to fall back toward Eagle Canyon, toward the rest of the brigade. Instead, we're going to withdraw laterally, continuing to threaten their flanks and supply lines." Reed studied the diagram, his tactical mind quickly grasping the implications. "That goes against Doctrine too. We're supposed to consolidate, not disperse. Doctrine assumes we're fighting a conventional battle with conventional objectives." Wilkins looked up. meeting Reed's gaze directly. But there's nothing conventional about our situation. We're 16 tanks against 200. If we fight by the book, we lose. The lieutenant's expression changed, something clicking into place. That's why Stanford wanted you to retire. You don't play by his rules. Wilkins shrugged. Stanford is a good officer in many ways. He understands modern systems, modern doctrine, but he's never had to fight outnumbered and outgunned. I have. He returned to his map. Get some rest, Lieutenant. Tomorrow we'll test everything we've got. As Reed walked back to his tank, a new understanding began to form in his mind. West Point had taught him doctrine, procedures, the science of warfare. But what he was witnessing with Wilkins was something else. The art of warfare, born not from textbooks, but from hard-won experience and a deep understanding of human psychology. For the first time, Reed began to see why men like Rodriguez followed Wilkins with such loyalty. It wasn't just respect for rank or experience. It was recognition that some men possessed a quality that couldn't be taught or codified, an intuitive grasp of battle that transcended doctrine and turned disadvantage into opportunity. Back in his tank, Reed finally found sleep, his mind settled by this new perspective. Whatever tomorrow brought, he would face it with a broader understanding of what it meant to be a tank commander. The eastern sky was just beginning to lighten when Wilkins was awakened by Rodriguez's hand on his shoulder. Movement to the east, Rodriguez said without preamble. Opfers rolling. Wilkins was instantly alert, years of combat having conditioned him to transition from sleep to full awareness in seconds. He climbed up to his commander's position, binoculars already in hand. The pre-dawn light revealed what they had expected but hoped to avoid. Opfer was advancing in full strength, a massive column of armor pushing toward Arbor Ridge. Their formation had changed, reflecting their new understanding of the situation. Instead of the previous day's confident, straight-ahead advance, they were now deployed in a broader front, with reconnaissance elements probing ahead and flanking units providing security. They're being more cautious, Wilkins observed. That's good. It means they still aren't sure of our strength. Rodriguez nodded. But they're coming hard. That's Maxwell making his move before Stanford can consolidate at Eagle Canyon. Wilkins keyed his radio. All Thunder units, this is Thunder 6. OPE for advancing in force. Execute deception plan, Charlie. Acknowledge. One by one, the units reported in, moving to their assigned positions according to the plan Wilkins had developed overnight. It was their most elaborate deception yet, designed to create the impression of a fighting withdrawal while actually setting up a series of ambushes along Opfer's flanks. Thunder 6, this is Thunder 2, Reed's voice came over the radio. In position at Point Echo, visibility limited by morning haze but thermal showing multiple Opfer units approaching from the southeast. Roger, Thunder 2, hold position until they cross phase line Bravo, then execute as planned. The radio crackled again, this time with Stanford's voice on the command frequency. Thunder 6, this is Brigade 6, report status. Brigade 6, Thunder 6. OPE for advancing in force toward Arbor Ridge. We are executing delaying actions as planned. There was a pause before Stanford responded. Understood, Thunder 6. Be advised that Eagle Canyon defensive positions are now 70% complete. We need another 4 hours to finalize artillery emplacements. Roger that, Brigade 6. We'll buy you that time. Thunder 6 out. Wilkins exchanged a glance with Rodriguez. 4 hours against Opfer's full advance would be a tall order. Think we can give them 4 hours? Rodriguez asked, echoing his thoughts. We have to, Wilkins replied simply. The sun crested the eastern horizon, illuminating the desert landscape with golden light. In the valley below, Opfer's advance continued, hundreds of vehicles moving in coordinated fashion. The mock Soviet force was impressive, their tactics textbook perfect, but perfection could become predictability, and that was what Wilkins was counting on. All Thunder units, this is Thunder 6, he radioed. Execute Phase 1. Engage at will. Across Arbor Ridge, Charlie Company's tanks opened fire simultaneously. The valley erupted with the simulated destruction of OPFOR's lead elements. Tanks displaying the red flags of kills ground to a halt, creating obstacles for the vehicles behind them. But OPFOR's response was swift and overwhelming. Artillery simulations, pyrotechnics, and smoke began impacting across Charlie Company's positions. Return fire from dozens of tanks swept the ridgeline, forcing the American tanks to quickly withdraw to secondary positions. They've got our range dialed in, Rodriguez reported as Thunderbolt backed down from its firing position. Counter-battery radar must have picked up our firing signatures. All part of the plan, Wilkins replied, scanning the battlefield through his binoculars. Willis, you're up. On the northern flank, Sergeant Willis's group executed their part of the plan. 4 tanks emerged from concealed positions, fired a coordinated volley at Opfor's flank, then quickly disappeared into a ravine before effective return fire could be brought to bear. The effect was immediate. Opfor's advance briefly faltered as units turned to address this new threat. Radio intercepts, monitored by Charlie Company's attached signals intelligence vehicle, revealed confusion in the OPFOR ranks. They think they're being hit by a fresh unit, reported the SIGINT operator, calling it a battalion-sized element on the northern flank. Wilkins smiled grimly. The deception was working. While OPFOR's command might suspect they were facing fewer tanks than initially reported, the carefully orchestrated attacks from multiple directions continued to create confusion about the actual size and disposition of the force opposing them. For the next hour, Charlie Company executed a complex dance of fire and movement. Tanks appeared briefly to engage, then withdrew before OPFOR could bring their superior numbers to bear. The desert terrain, with its network of ridges, ravines, and dry washes, provided perfect cover for this hit-and-run strategy. But OPFOR was adapting. General Maxwell, recognizing the pattern, began deploying specialized hunter-killer teams to track and eliminate Charlie Company's tanks. These small, fast-moving units were harder to evade, especially as they began to understand the routes and hiding places Charlie Company was using. Thunder 6, this is Thunder 3, came Sergeant Willis's voice, tense but controlled. We've got hunter-killers on our tail. Request permission to withdraw to phase line Delta. Permission granted, Thunder 3. Draw them toward Point Oscar if possible. Point Oscar was a carefully prepared kill zone where Reed's group was waiting in concealed positions. If Willis could draw the OPFOR hunter-killers into the trap, they could eliminate one of the greatest threats to their continued operation. Wilkins watched through his binoculars as Willis's tanks appeared on a ridgeline to the north, clearly visible to OPFOR's hunter-killers. After firing a few rounds, Willis's group withdrew exactly as planned, moving toward Point Oscar with the OPFOR units in pursuit. Thunder 2, this is Thunder 6, Wilkins radioed. Thunder 3 is inbound to your position with company. Be ready. Thunder 6, Thunder 2, we're ready. Targets will enter kill zone in approximately 2 minutes. Wilkins held his breath as the trap was sprung. Reed's tanks, concealed in hold-down positions, opened fire simultaneously as the OPFOR hunter-killers entered the kill zone. Within seconds, all 5 OPFOR vehicles were displaying the red flags of simulated destruction. Thunder 6, Thunder 2, hunter-killer element neutralized. No casualties on our side. Well done, Thunder 2. Relocate immediately to position Foxtrot. The morning wore on, the temperature rising with the sun. OPFOR's advance continued, slowed but not stopped by Charlie Company's delaying actions. By 1,000 hours, OPFOR had pushed halfway through the Arbor Ridge complex, forcing Charlie Company to give ground while continuing to harass their flanks and rear. Inside Thunderbolt, the temperature had climbed past 110 degrees. Wilkins and his crew were drenched in sweat, their uniforms dark with moisture. Water was rationed carefully, each man knowing they needed to stay hydrated to maintain focus in the punishing heat. Thunder 6, this is Eagle Eye, came a call from one of the observation posts. OPFOR main element has reached phase line Charlie. They're deploying bridging equipment at the dry riverbed. This was a critical moment. The dry riverbed represented a natural obstacle that would slow OPFOR's advance if they couldn't get their bridging equipment deployed. All Thunder elements, this is Thunder 6, Wilkins ordered. Concentrate fire on bridging vehicles. Priority target. Charlie Company's tanks, now widely dispersed across the battlefield, adjusted their fire toward the OPFOR engineering vehicles attempting to deploy the bridges. Precise shots disabled several bridge layers, forcing OPFOR to bring up reserves. They're committing more resources to the crossing, Rodriguez observed. That's good. Every minute they spend trying to cross that riverbed is another minute for the brigade to prepare. But OPFOR's superior numbers were beginning to tell. While Charlie Company focused on the bridging operation, other OPFOR elements were pushing around the flanks, threatening to encircle the American tanks. Thunder 6, this is Thunder 4, came an urgent call from one of the tank commanders. We're taking heavy fire from the south. 3 of my tanks are showing damage indicators. Request permission to withdraw. Thunder 4, Thunder 6, permission granted. Fall back to Rally Point Echo. The situation was deteriorating. Charlie Company had been fighting for over 3 hours, constantly moving, engaging, withdrawing. Men were exhausted, tanks were developing mechanical issues from the strain, and ammunition was running low. Thunder 6, this is Thunder 2, Reed called in. OPFOR has established a crossing point at grid reference Lima 29er, main force beginning to cross. Wilkins checked his map. OPFOR had successfully breached the dry riverbed, despite Charlie Company's best efforts. Once their main force was across, the American tanks would be in serious danger of encirclement. All Thunder units, this is Thunder 6, execute withdrawal plan Delta, acknowledge. One by one, the units acknowledged the order. Withdrawal plan Delta was their contingency for exactly this situation, a phased retreat designed to prevent encirclement while continuing to delay the enemy advance. As Thunderbolt began to move toward its designated rally point, Stanford's voice came over the command frequency. Thunder 6, this is Brigade 6, status report. Brigade 6, Thunder 6. OPFOR has breached the riverbed obstacle and is continuing to advance. We are executing withdrawal plan Delta to avoid encirclement. Stanford's voice was tense. Thunder 6, we need another hour at minimum to complete our preparations. Can you hold them? Wilkins surveyed the battlefield. OPFOR was advancing steadily now, their superior numbers allowing them to push forward while addressing threats to their flanks. Holding them for another hour with conventional tactics would be virtually impossible. But Wilkins had never been one for conventional tactics. Brigade 6, Thunder 6. We'll hold them, but I'll need to improvise. There was a pause before Stanford replied, his tone revealing a new respect. Understood, Thunder 6. Do what you need to do. Brigade 6 out. Wilkins switched to the company frequency. All Thunder units rally at Point Zulu immediately. I repeat, all units to Point Zulu. Point Zulu was a concealed depression behind the main ridgeline, one of several emergency rally points they had established. Within 15 minutes, the remaining tanks of Charlie Company had gathered there. 14 of the original 16, 2 having been ruled destroyed in the morning's engagement. Wilkins stood in his commander's hatch, addressing the assembled tank commanders who had dismounted to hear the plan. Gentlemen, we've bought the brigade 3 hours. They need one more. OPFOR is advancing steadily now, and conventional delaying tactics won't stop them. He paused, looking at each man in turn. So we're going to try something unconventional. He quickly outlined his plan, a high-risk, high-reward strategy that would consolidate their remaining strength for one decisive action rather than continuing the dispersed harassment. Questions? Wilkins asked when he finished. Reed spoke up. Sir, with respect, this is an all-or-nothing play. If it fails, we'll have no fallback position. That's correct, Lieutenant. But if it succeeds, we give the brigade the time they need, and we extract our forces intact. The tank commanders exchanged glances, weighing the risks. Finally, Rodriguez spoke for all of them. We're with you, Captain, just like Pleiku. Wilkins nodded, feeling a surge of pride in these men who trusted him with their lives. Mount up, execute on my mark. As the commanders returned to their tanks, Reed lingered. Sir, I just wanted to say, I was wrong about you, about all of this. Wilkins clapped him on the shoulder. You weren't wrong, Lieutenant. You were just working with the information you had. That's all any of us can do. Reed nodded and returned to his tank. Within minutes, Charlie Company was moving out, no longer retreating but advancing, directly toward OPFOR's main column. Inside OPFOR's mobile command post, General Maxwell studied the tactical display with growing satisfaction. After a frustrating start, his forces were finally making steady progress. The enemy force that had so effectively delayed them was now in retreat, their strength clearly diminished. Sir, reported his intelligence officer, scout elements report enemy tanks withdrawing toward Eagle Canyon. It appears they're abandoning Arbor Ridge entirely. Maxwell nodded. As expected, they've done their job, delaying us as long as possible. Now they're falling back to the main defensive line. He turned to his operations officer. Accelerate the advance. I want the lead elements at the approaches to Eagle Canyon within the hour. Yes, sir. Shall we maintain flank security? Maxwell considered this. The flanking attacks had diminished in the past hour, suggesting the enemy had either run low on ammunition or had been ordered to withdraw. Reduce flank security to minimum levels. Concentrate our force for the main push. The order went out, and OPFOR's advance accelerated. Their tanks and armored personnel carriers picking up speed as they pushed through the last sectors of Arbor Ridge. It was precisely what Wilkins had anticipated. Charlie Company, having circled around through a series of concealed ravines, was now positioned directly opposite OPFOR's least defended flank. The 14 remaining tanks were clustered together for the first time, presenting a concentrated striking force rather than the dispersed elements Offer had been facing. All tanks, weapons free, Wilkins ordered. Fire at will. 14 105mm guns opened fire simultaneously, their rounds slamming into the exposed flank of Opfer's column. Vehicles displaying kill indicators ground to a halt, creating confusion and blocking the narrow passage Opfer was using to advance. Push forward, Wilkins commanded. Keep firing. Charlie Company's tanks advanced in a tight formation, maintaining a continuous fire as they moved. The effect on Opfer was dramatic. With their flank security reduced, they were unprepared for this concentrated attack. Vehicles turned to face the new threat, but the sudden change in direction created chaos in their tightly packed column. Rodriguez guided Thunderbolts skillfully through the terrain, positioning for maximum effect. Cooper, the gunner, gunner was firing with methodical precision, each round finding its mark. They're in disarray, Reed reported over the radio. Command vehicles are pulling back. The gambit was working. By concentrating their force for one massive strike, Charlie Company had created the impression of a major counterattack, perhaps reinforcements arriving from the main brigade. Opfer's advance had not just slowed, it had stopped entirely as units turned to address this new threat. But the advantage couldn't last. Opfer's superior numbers would eventually tell, especially once they reorganized to face this new attack. Wilkins had calculated they had perhaps 10 minutes before Opfer brought overwhelming force to bear. All units prepare for Phase 2, he ordered. On my mark. The second phase of the plan was even riskier than the first. Having disrupted Opfer's advance with a concentrated attack, Charlie Company would now split into individual tanks, each taking a different escape route, creating the impression of a much larger force dispersing. Execute Phase 2 now. The 14 tanks broke formation, each heading in a different direction. Some fired smoke rounds to cover their movement. Others used the natural terrain for concealment. The effect was a chaotic dispersal that made it impossible for Opfer to determine their actual strength or intention. Wilkins watched with satisfaction as Opfer's response became increasingly confused. Some units pursued individual American tanks, others maintained defensive positions. Still others waited for orders that were slow in coming as Opfer's command struggled to assess the situation. It's working, Rodriguez said, guiding Thunderbolt down a narrow wash that provided cover from Opfer's fire. They don't know which way to turn. How long until Rally Point Omega? Wilkins asked. 15 minutes if we push it. Rally Point Omega was their final extraction point, a position far to the west of Arbor Ridge where the tanks could regroup before falling back to the main brigade position at Eagle Canyon. Push it, Wilkins ordered. For the next 15 minutes, Charlie Company executed a masterful extraction, each tank following its designated escape route while continuing to fire when possible, maintaining the illusion of a much larger force. Opfer's pursuit was disorganized, units chasing in multiple directions, unable to concentrate their superior numbers effectively. By the time Wilkins reached Rally Point Omega, 12 of the 14 tanks had already arrived. Reed's tank pulled in minutes later, bearing the marks of several near misses. Thunder 3 is not responding to radio calls, Reed reported as soon as he dismounted. Last seen heading south near grid reference Kilo 5. Sergeant Willis's tank was missing. Wilkins tried the radio again. Thunder 3, this is Thunder 6. Report status. Static. Thunder 3, this is Thunder 6. If you can hear me, respond on any channel. More static. Wilkins checked his watch. They had successfully delayed Opfer for nearly 4 hours, more than enough time for the brigade to complete its preparations at Eagle Canyon. Their mission was accomplished. But at what cost? Sir, Rodriguez said quietly, we need to move. Opfer will figure out where we've gone soon enough. Wilkins nodded reluctantly. All units, prepare to move out. Direction Eagle Canyon. As the tanks began to move, a radio call broke through the static. Thunder 6, this is Thunder 3. Willis's voice was strained but clear. Tank disabled. Crew unharmed. Currently evading on foot near grid reference Lima 7. Wilkins didn't hesitate. Thunder 3, hold position. We're coming to get you. Negative Thunder 6, Ope for elements in the area. Proceed to Eagle Canyon. We'll make our own way back. That's a negative, Thunder 3. No man left behind. Wilkins turned to Reed. Lieutenant, take the company to Eagle Canyon. Rodriguez and I will recover Willis and his crew. Reed started to protest, then stopped, recognizing the determination in Wilkins' eyes. Yes, sir. Good luck. As the rest of Charlie Company departed for Eagle Canyon, Wilkins and Rodriguez turned Thunderbolt toward grid reference Lima 7, where Willis and his crew were stranded. Just like old times, Rodriguez said, guiding the tank through the rough terrain. Let's hope not, Wilkins replied. Last time we did a crew recovery, you got shot. Details. The area around grid reference Lima 7 was a maze of small ridges and ravines, perfect for hiding or for an ambush. Wilkins scanned constantly through his binoculars, alert for any sign of OPFOR units. There, he said suddenly, pointing to a flicker of movement in a ravine about 500 meters away. That's them. Rodriguez adjusted course, keeping the tank in defilade to avoid detection. As they approached, Wilkins could make out 4 figures huddled in the shadow of a rock outcropping. Willis and his crew, trying to stay concealed from OPFOR patrols. Thunder 3, Thunder 6, Wilkins radioed. We have visual. Stay put. We're coming to you. Roger, Thunder 6. Be advised, OPFOR patrol passed through area 5 minutes ago, heading west. Wilkins scanned the terrain again. No sign of OPFOR, but that didn't mean they weren't there. Taking her in. What are you doing? Clear in, Rodriguez said, guiding Thunderbolt down into the ravine. The tank reached Willis and his crew without incident. The 4 men quickly climbed aboard, clinging to the turret and hull as Rodriguez reversed direction. What happened? Wilkins asked as Willis settled beside the turret. Track thrown during evasive maneuvers, Willis explained. Couldn't repair it in time. Had to abandon. You did the right thing, Wilkins assured him. Now let's get back to... Contact right, Cooper shouted from the gunner's position. Op for vehicles, 300 meters. Wilkins swiveled to look. 3 OPFOR tanks had appeared on a ridgeline to their right, turrets turning toward Thunderbolt. Evasive action, Wilkins ordered. Rodriguez responded instantly, throwing the tank into a sharp turn, narrowly avoiding the first simulated rounds from the OPFOR tanks. Can't outrun them with extra weight, Rodriguez warned, and Willis's crew are exposed up top. Wilkins made a quick decision. Find us cover. We'll make a stand. Rodriguez guided Thunderbolt behind a rock outcropping that provided partial cover from the OPFOR tanks. Wilkins ordered Willis and his crew to dismount and take cover behind the rocks. Cooper, target the lead tank, Wilkins ordered. Rodriguez, be ready to move as soon as he fires. Target acquired, Cooper reported. Range 280 meters. Fire! The 100mm gun roared. Through his binoculars, Wilkins saw the OPFOR tank display a hit indicator. Hit! Traversing to second target. But before Cooper could acquire the second tank, return fire began impacting around Thunderbolt's position. Simulated rounds kicked up dust and triggered proximity sensors on the tank's hull. We're taking hits, Rodriguez reported. Mobility damaged. In a real battle, they would be in serious trouble. Even in this exercise, the situation was dire. If Thunderbolt was ruled destroyed, they would be stranded miles from friendly lines. Cooper, keep firing, Wilkins ordered. Rodriguez, get us moving. Damaged or not. Cooper managed to score a hit on the second OPFOR tank, but the third was maneuvering to outflank them. Thunderbolt's systems were showing increasing damage as the simulated rounds found their mark. Engine at 50%, Rodriguez reported. We're losing her, Jim. Wilkins knew they had only moments before Thunderbolt would be ruled destroyed by the exercise controllers. He made another quick decision. Willis, your crew stays with us. We'll try to hold them off. Rodriguez, get our extra water and rations. If the tank's destroyed, we're going on foot. As the men prepared for the worst, a new sound cut through the battle noise, the distinctive roar of multiple tank engines approaching from the west. What the hell? Rodriguez muttered, peering through his vision port. Over the ridgeline to their west appeared 4 M60A3 tanks, advancing in battle formation. It was Reed and a detachment from Charlie Company, returning to assist. Thunder 6, this is Thunder 2, Reed's voice crackled over the radio. Thought you could use some help. The OPFOR tanks, now outnumbered, began to withdraw. Reed's tanks pressed the advantage, forcing them into a full retreat. Thunder 6 status, Reed inquired. Damaged but operational, Wilkins replied, relief evident in his voice. Good timing, Lieutenant. Couldn't leave you behind, sir. Not after everything you've taught us. With the OPFOR tanks in retreat, Reed's detachment formed a protective screen around the damaged Thunderbolt as they began the long journey back to Eagle Canyon. As they traveled, Stanford's voice came over the command frequency. All units be advised. Reforger exercise paused by command authority. All units hold in place and await further instructions. The tanks ground to a halt, commanders emerging from their hatches in confusion. What's going on? Willis asked. Before Wilkins could answer, the radio crackled again. Thunder 6, this is Brigade 6. Report to Eagle Canyon Command Post immediately. Bring your logs and after-action notes. Rodriguez and Wilkins exchanged worried glances. Sounds like we're in trouble, Rodriguez said. Or someone is, Wilkins replied. The journey to Eagle Canyon took nearly an hour, Thunderbolt limping along on its damaged systems. When they arrived, the scene was one of controlled chaos. Staff officers hurrying between command vehicles, radio operators relaying messages, all with an unusual sense of urgency for what was supposed to be a paused exercise. Stanford was waiting outside the command tent, his expression unreadable. Captain Wilkins, he said as Wilkins approached. Inside, now. The command tent was cooled by portable air conditioners, the relief from the desert heat almost shocking after hours in the baking tank. Inside, several senior officers were gathered around a tactical display, including, to Wilkins' surprise, General Maxwell, the OP-4 commander. Captain, Stanford began without preamble, General Maxwell has requested this meeting. He has some questions about your operations today. Wilkins straightened to attention. Sir? Maxwell, a burly man with salt and pepper hair and penetrating eyes, stepped forward. At ease, Captain. He studied Wilkins for a moment. You've caused quite a stir in my command today. 16 tanks effectively delaying a force of over 200. Unorthodox tactics, unconventional maneuvers. He paused, reminiscent of Arras, 1940. Wilkins couldn't hide his surprise. You're familiar with that battle, sir? I teach it at the War College, Captain. Maxwell's expression softened slightly. Along with several other examples of asymmetric warfare, it's something of a specialty of mine. Stanford looked between the two men, clearly not following the reference. Maxwell continued, what I want to know is how you managed to convince my intelligence staff that they were facing at least 60 tanks when you only had 16. Wilkins hesitated, uncertain how to respond. Was this a reprimand or a professional inquiry? Permission to speak freely, sir? Granted. Multiple factors, sir. Terrain utilization to maximize apparent force size. Coordinated fire from dispersed positions to create the impression of a larger force. Smoke and dust generation to obscure actual numbers. And perhaps most importantly, exploitation of your command's expectations in information processing. Maxwell raised an eyebrow. Explain that last part. Your intelligence officers were expecting to encounter a delaying force. When we hit harder than expected, they attributed it to greater numbers rather than different tactics. We reinforced that perception by appearing in multiple locations simultaneously and generating more visual and electromagnetic signatures than our actual size would suggest. Maxwell nodded slowly, then turned to Stanford. Colonel Captain Wilkins just gave a textbook explanation of perception management in battlefield deception. It's something we supposedly train for, but rarely execute effectively. He turned back to Wilkins. Where did you learn these tactics, Captain? I don't recall them being part of standard armor doctrine. Vietnam, sir, and from my father, who served under Patton in World War II. Wilkins paused. But mostly from studying military history. Battles where the smaller force managed to defeat, or at least delay, a larger one. Maxwell exchanged a glance with Stanford. The exercise has been temporarily halted because what happened today represents a significant deviation from expected outcomes. Your actions delayed my force nearly 3 times longer than offer command anticipated, forcing a complete reassessment of our timetable. Stanford finally spoke up. General Maxwell has requested that the remainder of the exercise be modified to incorporate the lessons from your actions today. Wilkins wasn't sure how to respond. Sir? Maxwell smiled slightly. What I'm saying, Captain, is that you've demonstrated a tactical approach that needs to be studied, not disciplined. We're halting the exercise to document what happened and potentially incorporate these methods into future training scenarios. Thank you, sir, Wilkins said, still not entirely sure what was happening. Don't thank me yet, Maxwell replied. I'm also requesting that you be assigned to work with my staff for the next week to fully debrief on your methods and help develop training materials based on today's events. Stanford nodded. I've already approved the temporary reassignment, Captain. Wilkins was stunned. Instead of being reprimanded for unorthodox tactics and disobeying doctrine, he was being asked to teach others his methods. Of course, sir. Happy to assist. Maxwell nodded approvingly. Good. We'll begin tomorrow. For now, get some rest. You and your men have earned it. As the meeting concluded and Wilkins stepped back out into the desert heat, he found Rodriguez waiting anxiously nearby. Well, Rodriguez asked, are we in trouble or what? Wilkins shook his head, still processing what had happened. No trouble. Quite the opposite, actually. They want to learn how we did it. Rodriguez grinned. No kidding? The brass actually wants to learn something from the old dogs? Apparently so. Wilkins looked across the Eagle Canyon position where the tanks of Charlie Company were being serviced by maintenance crews. The men were tired, dusty, but moving with the satisfaction of a job well done. Round up the company commanders. I want to personally thank every man for what they did today. Yes, sir. Rodriguez started to move away, then paused. Jim, your old man would be proud. Patton himself would be proud. Wilkins nodded, emotion unexpectedly tight in his throat. Maybe so, Doc, maybe so. As the desert sun began its descent toward the western mountains, Wilkins walked among the tanks and men of Charlie Company, the phantom battalion that had changed the course of Reforger 83. Each tank showed the signs of hard fighting: dust-caked surfaces, minor damage from rough terrain, exhausted crews working to restore them. Reed approached, his uniform sweat-stained and dusty, but his eyes bright with newfound respect. Sir, the men are asking what happens next. Is the exercise over? Wilkins shook his head. Not over. Changed. What we did today is going to be studied, analyzed, potentially incorporated into doctrine. Reed smiled. So the old lessons still have value? The good ones always do, Lieutenant. War changes its face, but not its nature. Wilkins gazed across the desert battlefield where they had fought their phantom war. The principles remain the same. Know yourself, know your enemy, and make him see what you want him to see, not what's actually there. As the sun set behind the mountains, casting long shadows across Eagle Canyon, the men of Charlie Company gathered around their tanks. They were 16 against 200, a small force that had punched far above its weight. But more importantly, they had demonstrated that in warfare, perception could be as powerful as reality, that a phantom battalion could change the course of battle just as surely as a real one. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new lessons to teach and learn. But for tonight, they had earned their rest, secure in the knowledge that what they had accomplished would not be forgotten. In the gathering darkness, Wilkins placed a hand on Thunderbolt's battle-scarred hull. The tank had served them well, just as it had in jungles and mountains halfway around the world years before. Like its commander, it was older than most, considered obsolete by some, but still capable of surprising those who underestimated it. Get some rest, he told the assembled men. Tomorrow we teach the Army how to see ghosts. As the men dispersed to their sleeping areas, Wilkins remained beside his tank, watching the stars emerge in the desert sky. Somewhere out there, OPFOR was regrouping, analyzing, trying to understand how they had been so thoroughly deceived. General Maxwell already knew the answer, had recognized it immediately when he mentioned Arras. It wasn't about technology or numbers or even training. It was about understanding the human element in warfare, how people perceive, process information, and react, how a small force properly employed could appear much larger, how deception, properly executed, could multiply combat power far beyond actual strength. These were lessons as old as warfare itself, temporarily forgotten in an age of technology and doctrine, but still powerful, still relevant. And tomorrow they would begin the process of reintegrating these ancient truths into modern military thinking. Wilkins smiled to himself as he climbed into his sleeping bag beneath the desert stars. The Phantom Battalion had done its work well, not just delaying OPFOR, but challenging assumptions, questioning doctrine, forcing a reevaluation of how modern armies fight. Not bad for 16 obsolete tanks and a bunch of old dogs who refused to learn new tricks. July 1998, Fort Knox, Kentucky. The afternoon light slanted through the windows of the Patton Museum, casting long shadows across the polished floor. The special exhibit on asymmetric warfare had drawn a larger crowd than usual, veterans mostly, men with weathered faces and knowing eyes who nodded in recognition as they studied the displays. Colonel James Wilkins, long retired, stood beside the M60A3 Patton tank designated Thunderbolt, watching as the young officers who had attended his presentation dispersed through the exhibit hall. One lieutenant lingered, studying the tactical map of Arbor Ridge that accompanied the display. Sir, the young officer said, turning to Wilkins, what happened after the exercise was halted? Did they actually incorporate your tactics into Army doctrine? Wilkins smiled, memories flooding back. That's the most interesting part of the story, Lieutenant. Come with me. He led the officer to a glass case at the far end of the hall, one that most visitors overlooked. Inside was a collection of documents, photographs, and a worn field manual with restricted stamped across its cover. This is what happened next, Wilkins said, pointing to the manual. FM 105-1, Deception Operations in Armor Warfare. published 1985, 2 years after Arbor Ridge. The lieutenant peered at the manual with newfound interest. They created an entire field manual based on your actions? Not just mine. General Maxwell was already studying historical examples of battlefield deception. What happened at Arbor Ridge gave him a contemporary case study and the political leverage to push for doctrinal changes. Wilkins tapped the glass. But before that manual was written, we had to convince a lot of skeptical officers that what happened wasn't just a fluke. Fort Irwin, California, July 1983. The morning after the halted exercise found Wilkins in an air-conditioned trailer that served as OPFR's Intelligence Analysis Center. Tactical displays covered the walls, showing the progress of Charlie Company's operations during the previous day's battle. General Maxwell stood at the head of the table, addressing a room filled with staff officers from both OPFR and the 5th Brigade. "Gentlemen," Maxwell began, "what you're looking at is one of the most effective deception operations conducted in a reforger exercise to date. Captain Wilkins and 16 tanks managed to convince our intelligence apparatus that they were facing a force at least 4 times that size." A major from OPFR's intelligence section raised his hand. "With respect, sir, there were contributing factors. Limited visibility due to dust and smoke, communication disruptions, the unexpected nature of their tactics. All part of the deception plan," Maxwell cut in. "Captain, would you care to elaborate?" Wilkins stood, feeling the weight of skeptical gazes. Most of these men were staff officers, products of a system that valued predictability and doctrine over improvisation. "The smoke and dust weren't accidental," he explained, moving to the tactical display. "We modified our tank's exhaust systems to produce more smoke than normal. We timed our movements to maximize dust clouds. We deliberately transmitted radio messages that could be intercepted, suggesting coordination with units that didn't exist." He traced the movement patterns on the display. "Most importantly, we understood how OPFR processes battlefield information. You expect certain behaviors from a delaying force. When we didn't conform to those expectations, it created cognitive dissonance. Your intelligence analysts resolved that dissonance by assuming we had more forces than we did, rather than questioning their fundamental assumptions about how a delaying force should behave." The room was silent as the officers processed this explanation. Finally, Colonel Stanford spoke up from the back. "Are you suggesting our intelligence procedures are flawed, Captain?" "Not flawed, sir. Predictable. And in war, being predictable is a vulnerability." Maxwell nodded approvingly. "This is precisely why I requested this meeting. Our current doctrine treats deception as a supporting element rather than a core component of operations. Captain Wilkins has demonstrated that with minimal resources, a commander who understands perception management can dramatically alter the battlefield equation." A lieutenant colonel from the War College faculty raised his hand. "General, are you suggesting we need to revise our doctrine based on a single exercise outcome?" "Not at all, Colonel. I'm suggesting we need to revise our doctrine based on thousands of years of military history, of which this exercise is merely the latest example." Maxwell gestured to Wilkins. "Captain Wilkins didn't invent these techniques. He applied historical lessons that we've systematically excluded from our modern doctrine because they don't fit neatly into our technological paradigm." The debate continued for hours, growing increasingly technical as staff officers questioned every aspect of Charlie Company's operations. Wilkins answered patiently, explaining each decision, each maneuver, each deception technique. By midday, even the most skeptical officers were engaged in serious discussion about how these methods might be formalized and taught. As the meeting adjourned for lunch, Maxwell pulled Wilkins aside. "You held your ground well, Captain." "Thank you, sir, though I'm not sure I convinced many of them." Maxwell smiled slightly. "You don't need to convince all of them. Just plant the seed." He paused. "I've been advocating for greater emphasis on deception operations for years, but the institutional resistance has been substantial. The Army prefers quantifiable factors: firepower, mobility, protection. Psychological operations are harder to measure, harder to predict, and harder to control," Wilkins added. "Precisely, which brings me to my next point." Maxwell handed Wilkins a folder. "I've requested your temporary assignment to my staff at the War College when this exercise concludes. I want you to help develop a formal curriculum on tactical deception for armor officers." Wilkins was speechless. The War College assignment was prestigious, a recognition of expertise that usually went to officers far senior to him. "Sir, I'm honored, but But you prefer commanding tanks to writing doctrine, I understand. Maxwell's eyes crinkled. It's only temporary, Captain. 3 months at most. After that, you can return to your company with my personal recommendation for promotion. Thank you, sir. I'll consider it. Do that. We need men who can think beyond doctrine, especially now. Maxwell's expression turned serious. The Soviets have been studying our patterns, our procedures, for decades. If conflict ever comes, it won't be won by the side with the best technology alone, but by the side that can adapt, surprise, and yes, deceive. As Maxwell walked away, Wilkins contemplated the folder in his hands. A war college assignment wasn't in his career plans. He'd always assumed he would retire as a captain or major, happiest when commanding tanks rather than sitting behind a desk or standing in front of a classroom. But if it meant these lessons would be preserved, would be taught to the next generation of officers, perhaps it was worth it. The afternoon session focused on practical applications. Using sand tables and tactical simulators, Wilkins demonstrated specific techniques Charlie Company had employed. The atmosphere had shifted, skepticism giving way to professional curiosity as officers began to see potential applications in their own areas. The key, Wilkins explained, standing over a sand table representation of Arbor Ridge, is to understand how your adversary processes information. Soviet doctrine emphasized rapid exploitation of breakthrough. We used that against them by making them question whether a breakthrough had actually occurred. Lieutenant Reed, who had been invited to join the session, added his perspective. As a West Point graduate, I was trained to follow established doctrine. Captain Wilkins showed us that doctrine is a starting point, not an end point. When the situation demands, you have to be willing to innovate. Stanford, who had been quietly observing, finally spoke. Captain Wilkins, I owe you an apology. I dismissed your historical perspective as outdated. I was wrong. The admission surprised everyone, especially Wilkins. Thank you, Colonel, but there was merit in your position, too. Modern warfare does require modern solutions. The trick is knowing when to apply which lessons. Stanford nodded appreciatively, the tension between them dissolving into mutual respect. As the day concluded, Wilkins found Rodriguez waiting outside the command trailer. How'd it go in there? Rodriguez asked, lighting a cigarette. Better than expected, they're actually listening. Miracles never cease. Rodriguez blew a smoke ring into the desert air. The boys are wondering when we get back to training. Willis is itching for a rematch with Upfer. Wilkins smiled. Charlie Company's pride in their accomplishment was palpable throughout the camp. The underdogs who had defied the odds, who had made a phantom battalion appear out of 16 tanks. Tomorrow we go back to the field. General Maxwell wants to run a modified exercise, this time with Opfer knowing our actual strength, but not our methods. See if the deception still works when they're looking for it. Rodriguez grinned. Challenge accepted. The next morning, Charlie Company assembled at their rally point, tanks fueled and ready. The men were in high spirits, eager to prove that their success had been skill, not luck. Wilkins gathered the tank commanders for a final briefing before they moved out. Today will be different, he cautioned. OPFOR knows our strength now. They'll be actively looking for deception. Our old tricks won't work. So what's the plan, Captain? Asked Sergeant Willis, fully recovered from his ordeal. New tricks. Wilkins unfolded a map. They'll be expecting us to disperse, to create the illusion of greater numbers through movement and fire. So instead, we're going to concentrate our force and hit them where they least expect it, directly. Reed raised an eyebrow. Frontal assault? That's not your usual style, sir. The best deception is the one they don't think is a deception, Wilkins replied with a hint of a smile. They'll be so busy looking for our phantom units that they won't recognize the real threat until it's too late. The plan was audacious, even by Wilkins standards. While OPFOR prepared for another day of dispersed harassment, Charlie Company would consolidate into a tight formation and drive straight through the center of OPFOR's advance, splitting their force before they could react. As the tanks moved into position, Wilkins sensed a new cohesion in his company. The previous day's success had transformed them from a collection of individual crews into a single, unified force. They trusted each other, trusted the plan, trusted their commander. All units in position, Reed reported. OPFOR advance elements crossing phase line Alpha. Roger, maintain radio silence until my command. All units prepare to execute on my mark. Through his binoculars, Wilkins watched OPFOR's advance. As predicted, they had adjusted their formation to counter the previous day's tactics. Reconnaissance elements probed widely, searching for dispersed American tanks. The main force moved more cautiously, alert for ambush from multiple directions. But no one was watching the center. "Execute now," Wilkins ordered. 16 tanks surged forward simultaneously, forming a tight wedge formation as they crested the ridge. The effect on Opfer was immediate and dramatic. Not expecting a concentrated attack, their center elements were caught unprepared, several vehicles displaying hit indicators before they could effectively respond. "Push through," Wilkins commanded. "Maintain formation and speed." Charlie Company drove hard into the gap they had created, splitting Opfer's formation in half. Confusion spread through the Opfer ranks as commanders tried to reorient to this unexpected development. Inside Opfer's command post, General Maxwell watched with undisguised satisfaction as the tactical display showed Charlie Company's bold thrust. "Brilliant," he murmured. "They're expecting ghosts, and he gives them a battering ram." His operations officer was less impressed. "Sir, it's a reckless maneuver. Once they break through, they'll be surrounded on all sides." "Will they?" Maxwell pointed to the display. "Look what's happening to our command and control." Opfer's communication networks were in chaos. With their formation split, unit commanders were calling for instructions, reporting contradictory information, struggling to coordinate a response. The smooth advance had disintegrated into disjointed reactions. "He's not trying to win a tactical victory," Maxwell explained. "He's disrupting our decision cycle, forcing us to react rather than act. By the time we reorganize, the damage is done." Meanwhile, Charlie Company had completed their breakthrough and was now executing the second phase of Wilkins' plan. Instead of continuing forward or turning to engage, the tanks dispersed in multiple directions, each taking a different route away from the point of contact. "Now they're back to deception," Reed observed as he guided his tank down a narrow ravine. "Not deception," Wilkins corrected. "Exploitation. We've disrupted their command and control. Now we're making it impossible for them to regain cohesion by presenting multiple threats they need to address simultaneously." For the next hour, Charlie Company executed a complex series of maneuvers, tanks appearing briefly to strike at vulnerable targets before disappearing again. No longer trying to create the illusion of greater numbers, they instead focused on maintaining continuous pressure, never allowing Opfer to reorganize or regain initiative. By midday, Opfer's advance had completely stalled. What had begun as a coordinated movement had devolved into a series of isolated defensive positions, each responding to local threats without overall coherence. "Thunder 6, this is Eagle Eye," came a call from one of the observation posts. "Opfer command elements are withdrawing to Rally Point Oscar. Repeat, they are withdrawing." Wilkins could hardly believe it. Opfer was calling off the advance entirely, something unprecedented in Reforger exercises. "All Thunder units rally at Point Sierra. Maintain vigilance during movement." As Charlie Company regrouped, Wilkins received a call on the command frequency. "Thunder 6, this is Olympus. General Maxwell's call sign. Exercise terminated. Assemble your company at Base Camp Alpha for immediate debrief." An hour later, Charlie Company rolled into Base Camp Alpha, where a sizable crowd had gathered. Officers from across the exercise area, observers from allied nations, even civilian contractors stood waiting as the dust-covered tanks formed a line in front of the reviewing stand. General Maxwell stepped forward as Wilkins dismounted from Thunderbolt. "Captain Wilkins, I'd have been conducting Reforger exercises for 7 years," Maxwell announced, his voice carrying across the assembled crowd. "This is the first time I've terminated an exercise early because one unit so thoroughly disrupted the opposing force that continuation became pointless." A murmur ran through the crowd. Maxwell turned to address them. "What you witnessed today was not just a tactical success, but a paradigm shift. Captain Wilkins and Charlie Company demonstrated that a numerically inferior force, properly employed, can defeat a superior force by controlling the psychological and informational dimensions of the battlefield." He gestured to the tanks of Charlie Company, their hulls bearing the marks of hard fighting across the desert terrain. These 16 tanks, led by officers and men who understand the true nature of warfare, have provided a lesson that will be studied at the War College for years to come. Wilkins felt a surge of pride, not for himself but for his men. They had accomplished what many thought impossible, had challenged doctrine and prevailed, had shown that the human element in warfare remained paramount, even in an age of technology. Maxwell continued, "Effective immediately, I am establishing a special task force to develop new doctrine incorporating the lessons from these engagements. Captain Wilkins will serve as technical advisor to this task force. The results will be presented to the Army Chief of Staff within 6 months. The announcement sent another ripple through the crowd. This wasn't just recognition, it was institutional validation of the highest order. As the formal proceedings concluded, Rodriguez approached Wilkins, a rare cigarette dangling from his lips despite regulations. "So," he said with a grin, "the old dogs get to teach the young pups some new tricks after all." "Looks that way," Wilkins replied, still processing the implications of Maxwell's announcement. "You going to take that War College assignment?" Wilkins nodded slowly. "I think I have to. This is bigger than us now, Doc. If these lessons can save lives in a real conflict, I can't walk away from that." Rodriguez clapped him on the shoulder. "Always knew you'd end up a teacher. Too damn smart to stay in the mud forever." Reed joined them, his young face flushed with excitement. "Sir, they're saying we might all get commendations. That General Maxwell is personally recommending the entire company for recognition." "We deserve it," Rodriguez declared. "Making 200 tanks stop in their tracks? That's worth a medal or two." Wilkins smiled but shook his head. "The real reward isn't medals, Lieutenant. It's knowing that what we did here might change how the Army fights, might save lives if the balloon ever goes up with the Soviets." As the sun began its descent toward the western mountains, the men of Charlie Company gathered one last time around their tanks. Tomorrow they would return to regular training, to the routine of military life. But for now, they savored this moment of triumph, of recognition, of knowing they had made a difference. Wilkins addressed them with simple words of praise, acknowledging each man's contribution, emphasizing that their success had been a team effort. As he concluded, he felt a rare emotion welling up, not pride in himself, but pride in what they had accomplished together. "Remember what we did here," he told them. "Not just the tactics or the maneuvers, but the mindset. Never accept that superior numbers or technology guarantee victory. Never forget that warfare is ultimately about human beings, their perceptions, their decisions, their breaking points. Understand those, and you can accomplish what others consider impossible." The men dispersed to their evening duties, but Rodriguez lingered behind. "Sounds like you've got your first lecture for the War College already prepared," he observed. Wilkins smiled ruefully. "Maybe so. Still hard to picture myself in that role." "You'll do fine. Just tell them the stories. About Arras, about Pleiku," Rodriguez gestured to the desert around them. "About Arbor Ridge. Real experiences beat theory every time." As darkness fell over Fort Irwin, Wilkins took one last walk around Thunderbolt. The tank had served them well, just as it had in Vietnam, just as thousands like it would continue to serve until newer models replaced them. But the lessons learned in this desert wouldn't become obsolete with the equipment. They were timeless, fundamental to the nature of warfare itself. The next morning, as Charlie Company prepared to return to their regular duties, Stanford approached Wilkins with an unexpected request. "Captain, before you leave for the War College, I'd like you to brief my staff on your tactical approach. They need to hear it directly from you." Wilkins was surprised by the colonel's humility. "Of course, sir. Happy to do it." "Good." Stanford hesitated, then added, "I've been thinking about what you said regarding historical lessons. Perhaps I've been too dismissive of the past in my enthusiasm for new technologies." "It's a balance, sir. The best commanders understand both the eternal principles of warfare and the changing face of the battlefield." Stanford nodded thoughtfully. "Well said, Captain. I look forward to reading the doctrine that comes out of your work with General Maxwell." 3 months later, Wilkins stood before a classroom at the Army War College, facing a group of lieutenant colonels and colonels preparing for senior command positions. On the wall behind him was a tactical map of Arbor Ridge, alongside historical maps of Arras, Chancellorsville, and other battles where deception had played a decisive role. "Gentlemen," he began, "today we're going to discuss perception management on the modern battlefield. How a small force can defeat a larger one not through superior firepower, but through superior understanding of human psychology and decision-making processes." The officers listened attentively as Wilkins walked them through the Arbor Ridge engagement, connecting it to historical precedents and extracting principles that could be applied in future conflicts. "The Soviets outnumber us in tanks by more than 3-1 along the Fulda Gap," he explained. "If conflict comes, many of you will face odds similar to what Charlie Company faced at Arbor Ridge. Your ability to use deception effectively may mean the difference between holding the line and being overrun." After the lecture, one colonel remained behind to speak with Wilkins privately. Captain, your presentation was illuminating. But I'm curious, do you believe these methods would work against the Soviets in actual combat? Their doctrine, their command structure, is quite different from our OPFOR. That's the right question, sir, Wilkins acknowledged. The answer is yes, but with adaptations. Soviet commanders operate under more rigid constraints than ours. They're less likely to deviate from approved doctrine without authorization from higher headquarters. That actually makes them more vulnerable to deception if we can predict their doctrinal responses. The colonel nodded slowly. I commanded a battalion in Germany for 2 years, always worried about what would happen if they came through the gap. Your approach gives me new perspectives to consider. That's all I can ask for, sir. Not that anyone adopts these methods wholesale, but that they become part of our tactical toolkit, available when circumstances warrant. As the colonel departed, General Maxwell entered the classroom, having observed the lecture from the back. Well done, Captain. You have a gift for teaching. Thank you, sir, though I still prefer tanks to classrooms. Maxwell smiled. And you'll get back to them soon enough. But what you're doing here matters. The doctrine manual is nearly complete. The Chief of Staff has already expressed interest in reviewing it personally. That's good news, sir. More than good. It's a paradigm shift. Maxwell studied the tactical displays. For too long, we've been fixated on technological solutions. Bigger guns, better sensors, more sophisticated systems. All important but insufficient if we don't understand the human dimension of warfare. Wilkins nodded in agreement. My father used to say that tanks don't win battles. Tankers do. Wise man, your father. Maxwell turned to leave, then paused. By the way, your promotion to major has been approved. Congratulations. Thank you, sir, though I never really sought advancement, which is precisely why you deserve it. Maxwell's eyes twinkled. Don't worry, Major. Once your time here is done, I've arranged for you to take command of a tank battalion, the 2nd of the 66th Armor. You'll have plenty of tanks to command. After Maxwell departed, Wilkins stood alone in the classroom, contemplating this unexpected turn in his career. A promotion, a battalion command, a hand in shaping Army doctrine, none of these had been his ambition when he'd taken Charlie Company into the desert at Fort Irwin. Yet perhaps this was where he could make the greatest difference. Not just leading 16 tanks, but influencing how hundreds of tanks and thousands of soldiers might fight in future conflicts. Ensuring that the lessons of Arras and Arbor Ridge would not be forgotten when they were needed most. July 1998, Fort Knox, Kentucky. And that's how a single exercise changed Army doctrine, Wilkins concluded, guiding the young lieutenant away from the display case. The field manual was implemented. FM 110.5.1 became required reading at the Command and General Staff College. Later editions incorporated additional lessons as technology evolved, but the core principles remained the same. The lieutenant looked back at the Thunderbolt tank. Did it ever matter? Did these techniques ever see actual combat? Wilkins smiled. More than you might think. Desert Storm, 1991. The famous Hail Mary maneuver that outflanked the Iraqi Republican Guard. That entire operation incorporated deception elements straight out of FM 100.5.1. Made the Iraqis believe our main effort was coming directly into Kuwait when actually we were swinging wide to the west. I've studied that campaign, sir. Schwarzkopf is credited with that strategy. And rightly so. He approved it, implemented it, made it work. But the doctrinal foundation, the understanding of how to manage enemy perceptions, that came from work that began at Arbor Ridge. They walked slowly through the museum as closing time approached, Wilkins occasionally pointing out other exhibits connected to the evolution of armor doctrine. What happened to the others? The lieutenant asked. Reed, Rodriguez, the men of Charlie Company. Rodriguez retired as a master sergeant in '91, right after Desert Storm. Last I heard, he was running a motorcycle repair shop in Arizona. Wilkins smiled at the memory of his old friend. Reed went further than any of us. Brigadier General Thomas Reed now commands the National Training Center at Fort Irwin. The same Fort Irwin where Arbor Ridge took place? The very same. He's transformed training there, making sure every unit that rotates through understands both the technological and psychological dimensions of modern warfare. Wilkins looked pleased. He never forgot the lessons. As they reached the museum exit, the lieutenant had one final question. Sir, if you had to distill everything from Arbor Ridge into a single lesson for officers today, what would it be? Wilkins considered this carefully. Never underestimate the importance of perception in warfare. Your enemy will not react to the reality of your forces. but to their perception of your forces. Shape that perception skillfully, and you can achieve what seems impossible. The lieutenant nodded, clearly impressed by both the story and the man. Thank you, sir, for the presentation and for your service. You're welcome, Lieutenant. Good luck with your career. As the young officer departed, Wilkins took one last look at Thunderbolt before the museum closed for the evening. The old tank stood silent, its battle scars hidden beneath fresh paint and careful restoration. Yet the true legacy of Arbor Ridge wasn't preserved in metal and machinery, but in the doctrine, the training, and the mindset of a new generation of officers. Wilkins placed his hand on Thunderbolt's hull, feeling a connection to that distant summer in 1983 when 16 tanks had created a Phantom Battalion and changed the course of military thinking. "We did all right, old friend," he murmured to the tank. "We did all right." Outside the museum, the sun was setting over Fort Knox, casting long shadows across the home of American armor. Somewhere in the distance, the distinctive rumble of tank engines could be heard as a new generation of soldiers trained for conflicts yet to come. They would face different enemies, use different equipment, fight in different terrain. But the lessons of Arbor Ridge would still apply, that in warfare, perception could be as powerful as reality, and a Phantom Battalion could change the course of battle just as surely as a real one.